saw posters advertising strikes and rallies with Tony Benn speaking. And I have to say, I went to school here in the mid-1970s at the LSE, and those were the same posters and rallies that it was wonderful. Ian Goff did disabuse me of my optimism by telling me that this hadn't been a continuous trajectory, and then actually there's been a resurgence of opposition lately. I want to start with a point that Tim made, which is events, dear boy, or dear girl, events. Because I think if we're going to make any progress, and I can move around, right? Yeah. Make progress on an agenda of sustainability and carbon emission reductions and greenhouse gas emission reductions, we have to recognize the new reality in which we are living. And first and foremost, that has to do with economics. So I'm going to go very quickly through the premise of my talk, which is that we must have... Is this a familiar diagram to people? I'll say more about it. I assume it would be. In 2009, Johan Rockström and a worldwide group of scientists and ecologists published a paper in Nature in which they argued that humans were coming up against, and in a number of cases had exceeded, planetary boundaries in terms of a safe operating space for humanity within the biosphere. So that idea will be quite familiar. They identified 3 areas where we had already exceeded critical thresholds of safe functioning. The first is climate, the second is biodiversity. So here's the biodiversity, climate, and the third is nitrogen cycle. But they also noted, they looked at 9 areas that, in terms of ocean acidification, ozone depletion, phosphorus cycling, fresh water use, land system use. In all of those, we were beginning to approach the limits at which the planet could really tolerate the human impacts that it was experiencing. And in a couple of cases, pollution, chemical pollution, aerosol loading, there's not enough data yet. And of course, there are a number of other areas that they could have looked at. They just chose these 9. So we are in a moment of planetary emergency. Climate, of course, being the issue that I think we are most aware of, but also on biodiversity and other ecosystem threats. We have to really act urgently, we have to act decisively, and we have to make big changes in the way we live. That's, of course, an underlying premise of most sustainability work, and I think of the Resolve work as well. Now, events, dear boy, events. We are those of us who are involved in a sustainability transition are attempting to do this at a time which historically we would have to say is a very difficult moment for doing it. And I'm going to talk about why that is in a little bit more detail. But the punchline of the first half of my talk is that an economic crisis, high unemployment, slow growth, all of those things make the task of ecological protection, of reducing eco-impact, of getting policies in which will do that so much more difficult. And I'll talk to you a little bit in the spirit of that interdisciplinarity that Tim talked about. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about why that is. But the first point is that 2008, of course, we had a global financial panic and economic meltdown. In the wealthy parts of the world, that slowdown and that economic situation continues to dominate policymaking, public consciousness, and even more important, people's everyday experiences. China, India, Brazil, they've come out of it much more easily for reasons which I think are pretty easy to understand or somewhat obvious. The wealthy countries of the world, it's a different story. And the first big point that I want to make to you here is that going forward, the economic situation in countries like this one, in Europe, Western Europe, particularly in my own country, the US, likely in Japan, is going to continue to be difficult and constraining. Now, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about why that is. This is a picture of unemployment in Western Europe back through 1970. And one of the things that we see, and if I continued it out, what we have now is about, since the downturn, average unemployment in Europe at about 8% or so, measured unemployment. Of course, there's a lot more hidden unemployment in every country. But one of the things that's happening, and this is well known, but I think it's important to recognize its impact on the sustainability discourse, is that we are in wealthy regions, high-cost regions in a globalizing world in which the differences in standards of living, wages, costs, etc., between the wealthy parts of the world and the poorer parts of the world are shrinking and will continue to shrink. And that the ability to produce jobs in high-cost, wealthy areas or in high-regulation areas and so forth is increasingly undermined by globalization. And so we have, in a place like Western Europe or in the United States, long-term increases in a kind of underlying structural unemployment and underemployment that have been going on, as you see here, for decades, and something similar. So that's the first point. It's a globalizing world that makes it harder and harder to generate jobs in the high-cost, rich parts of the world. That's not news to anyone in this room, but it's important to keep in mind as we think about what the economic context in which we do this work is. Second point, really important, is that we are yet again, and Tim mentioned the 1930s, and of course in Britain the Depression started in the 20s. We are yet again in a moment in which bankers have a stranglehold over economic policy. And we see it in the Eurozone crises, of course. We see it in the push for deficit cutting and austerity in a period of widespread unemployment and economic weakness, weak aggregate demand, high unemployment. And what is the policy discourse about? It's about budget cutting and austerity. This is the same debate that went on almost 100 years ago. And the Depression lasted as long as it did because policymakers paid attention to the banks. This is not just a conspiracy theory. If you look at the minutes of the Federal Reserve, for example, and I'm sure if someone's done the same study for Britain, you find it, the interests of bondholders are absolutely central at moments like this. You only have to open the financial pages of any newspaper to see that. The fear that the bondholders will worry about inflation, the fear that they will stop buying all this government paper. So there's a stranglehold on policy at the moment, and this is likely to continue. Bankers and bondholders, and those are by and large what we think of financial institutions because they're the creditors. They're the creditor groups here who are absolutely concerned about inflation, which reduces the value of their assets. So their primary concern in a period like this is to make sure that policy is not too expansionary, does not lead to price increases. And what that does is it keeps a kind of stranglehold on what the government can do. This is true at the level of the European Union, it's true in this country, it's true in the United States, it was true in the 1930s. There was a recovery in the middle of the Great Depression in the 1930s, and it was choked off by the Federal Reserve precisely for this reason. And if we get into a double dip now, it will have been really the same story. And the political power of these folks is very, very great. And so we're not going to have the kind of expansionary macro policy that could actually solve unemployment, get countries growing again, etc. So, for political reasons connected to the power of the financial sector, we're going to continue to see what, in conventional terms, we would think of as economic weakness. I don't like that word for reasons we'll see in a minute. High unemployment, a lot of economic pain, continued growth of austerity policies. I just want to say something about the U.S. here. This is a graph of a combination of unemployment and underemployment in the United States. The official rates now for underemployment, that is people who are involuntarily in part-time work and who need more work, plus the fully unemployed, not counting the people who are out of the labor force and disguised unemployment. So this is an underestimate. This is now over 18%, and the job numbers continue to look terrible. Job creation is not keeping up with new entrants. We've got 5 people looking for every available job in the United States. We've got 25 million people in the U.S. underemployed, unemployed. We've got 44 million people on food stamps. We have a level of unemployment that is in some ways rivaling what we saw in the 1930s. Not quite there yet. One more thing that makes this situation difficult is that the current economic dynamics are continuing to concentrate wealth and income at the top, and not just at the top. I mean, we went through the 1980s, the 1990s, with income flowing to the top 20%. That's a very familiar story. In the 2000s, income flowed to the top 1%. And this is a global phenomenon. These are the US data. We are more extreme in this, but the continued concentration of income and wealth through this period also leads to more economic weakness and less ability to solve economic problems because the concentration of wealth undermines demand in the market. Now, of course, there's a point here, which is that weak demand and slow growth has the other side of typically reducing ecological impact. But it's not a happy way to do it, and as I'll show you in a minute, I think it's a dangerous, when environmentalists cheer when there's a recession, it's a very short-sighted and dangerous from the point of view of where things are going to go. So that's the unemployment picture. I'll come back to it, but the big takeaway from what I've said so far is that we can expect continuing stagnation, austerity, high unemployment, and a bad economic situation. One more reason why has to do with what's going on with commodity prices. Of course, this heading doesn't match with this graph, but the heading is, I'm going to show you the 2 slides afterwards, in case you're wondering why escalating commodity prices shows 100 years plus 150 years of declining commodity prices. This is a really interesting point. It's one of the things that back in the 1970s people who were concerned about development were jumping up and down about, because the countries that exported commodities, food and energy and timber and so on and so forth, were getting lower and lower prices for their goods, and it was a part of a cycle of impoverishment. While you see occasional ups and downs there with the business cycle, of course you see the big drop with the worldwide downturn in the 20s and 30s, big long-term trend for declining commodities prices. This is one of the things that the ecologists in the 1970s who said we're facing limits to growth had to contend with, because it was true that we were facing limits to growth. Why were commodities prices still declining after such a long period of time? Well, one of the things that happened after the 21st century, and by the way, just when they predicted these prices were going to start rising, is that commodities prices began to rise. Food prices, energy prices, timber prices, metals prices, pretty much across the board in commodities, they're getting more and more expensive. Combination of reasons: heavy demand from China, particularly, there's speculation, but also I believe we have entered a period in which we have reversed that long century and a half of declining commodities prices. And one of the reasons I think that's true is you see the decline from the, after 08, you see the decline at the end there from the economic collapse. Look how quickly food prices revived after the global economic collapse. We in the wealthy countries are still experiencing a lot of economic weakness. Food prices are now back to where they were in 2008. It's part of why we're seeing uprisings around the world, because people can no longer afford food increasingly, and I think we're going to see continuing increases. This puts additional economic pressure into the system and makes solving economic issues even that much harder, raising prices and further squeezing on the cost side. So that's the environment. Those are the events, dear boy and dear girl, in which we have to now do the work of making a sustainable transition. And what that means for me is that the policies, the messages, the communications, the substance of what we're doing, our thinking, has to be informed at its very core by solving those economic problems that we talked about, as well as the ecological problems that got us, many of us, into this work in the first place. This is a really worrisome set of polling data. Gallup, it's the United States data. Be curious to see if there's any kind of similar data for the UK. In 1985, the Gallup organization started asking Americans the following question: which one of these statements about the environment and the economy do you most agree? Protection of the environment should be given priority even at the risk of curbing economic growth. Or the reverse, economic growth should be given priority even if the environment suffers. Throughout the 80s, 90s, and even up until the crisis, 2007 was the last year of the expansion, environment consistently outpulled economy. Of course, in the 80s, and early 90s, it was a much bigger gap. But for the first time since they began collecting this data, economy is now outpolling environment. People are saying that we can't risk losing jobs, or we can't do things which are going to reduce jobs and economic growth just in order to protect the economy, or the environment. Now, why does that matter so much? The discourse about environment is that, and that's what this polling data suggests, and this is, I think, a huge challenge for us. The discourse about the environment is that it's a luxury, that it's something we can protect and do something about in good times, but when times get tough, we can't worry about it. And this kind of thinking underlies, at its very core, is what mainstream economics teaches about the environment, and it's encapsulated here in a very famous theory, which is the so-called environmental Kuznets curve. Now, what is that? The environmental Kuznets curve says that in the early stages of growth, the environment will worsen. So that's the story about China, India, Brazil. Well, of course, those people have to despoil their environment because they're poor, and they have no choice. It's worth it to them to pollute their their cities and destroy their ecosystems and give cancer to their people because economic growth is so valuable to them. But there's a point at which they get rich enough that that will start to change, and then the environment will start to improve as people will start to pressure policymakers to clean up the air and so on and so forth. And this is the interpretation of what happened in this country, it's the interpretation of what happened in the United States, in Europe, and it's the standard interpretation of what happened, what's happening now in the poor countries of the world and the global south. So you get more environmental degradation as you start to grow, and then you get less. Turns out it's completely false for the most important environmental problem of our day, which is climate, which is the more you grow, the more you destroy the climate. It works out for one or two small regulated gases like sulfur dioxide and a couple of others. But for the most part, the literature shows it not to be true. But that's not my point here. My point here is that it's what economics says is true, and it's what the popular wisdom, the sort of hegemonic belief about the environment incorporates this trade-off. The person on the street believes this. And the idea that the environment is a luxury rather than the most basic necessity of life, which is the scientific reality about the environment. The environment is our most basic necessity of life. Without clean air and water and land, we cannot live. The ability of mainstream economics to turn the environment into a luxury rather than a basic necessity it's like a stunning ideological feat, but it's one that actually turns out to be a major challenge for us. So I've been doing qualitative research on people's attitudes about climate change and environmentalism and sustainable lifestyles, green consumption, and so on and so forth. And this is what people say. If you're poor, you just have to worry about survival. The environment is something for rich people. The poor people say it, the rich people say it, the people in the middle say it. We're interviewing people across all income classes and social classes with particular attention to their class position. And one of the common tropes that comes up is if you don't have enough money to put food on the table, people can't care about the environment. And the only people who care about the environment are the rich people. Never mind it's totally upside down in terms of actual income, right? The higher income people have much higher impacts on the environment. They consume a lot more, they have bigger eco-footprints, a bigger carbon footprints. But this is a big part of what we have to contend with, which is that it's a underneath the consciousness, underneath the surface way that people think about the environment. Is that, as this is Maslow's hierarchy, and I call it Maslow's hegemony. The higher up you go, the more environmentally conscious you are. So, again, solving the economic problem is absolutely central to solving the sustainability problem. So what can we do about it then? So that's the challenge that we have. We're in a period of very difficult economic times. We have a discourse, spoken and unspoken, conscious and unconscious, in which people think that we just can't afford to do these things, that even if they think they're good to do. Most of the interviews we did, people think, yeah, climate change is a problem, we should do something about it, but the average person can't anymore because of what's going on in the environment. So, what is a policy intervention? What is a message? What is a new kind of economy that actually allows us to solve both those problems at once? The key, I think the centerpiece of a new approach has to do with time and working time. And that's because reductions in working hours are absolutely crucial for solving the unemployment problem, which is key to getting the economy back on track on the one hand, and because they're also central to reducing carbon footprint and eco footprint. So I see an approach which puts work time at the center as really, really important going forward, particularly now in this time. So let me say a little bit more about that. This is a graph of what happened to working hours from 1870 to 1970. So 100 years in which what you see, obviously, is all of these six early industrializing countries had dramatic reductions in average hours of work over this period of time. In 1870, the average work year in these countries was about 3,000 hours a year, which is about a 60-hour work week. Of course, we know some of the most vulnerable portions of the labor force were older women and children, had even longer hours, but on average, we were about that 3,000. And all of these countries reduced their working hours through reductions in the number of days worked per year, in the growth of a weekend, in reductions in daily hours over this period. That's a story I think that's probably very familiar to you all because of how important the UK was in leading the world in many ways in work time reduction. One of the really important lessons to get from this graph, and you can't see it because I've just got the work hours here, but it relates to something that you know already, is that this was also a period, with the exception of the Great Depression, which saw increasingly high employment in these countries, particularly as we get later into the 20th century. And the goal of not just high employment, but full employment, which came to be adopted by all of these countries in the post-war era, and which in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, we were starting to get pretty close to. And even, you know, in some of these countries in the Netherlands, Germany, did well even through the more difficult era of the 80s and 90s. Now, what was going on is that productivity growth, and these economies were all generating lots of productivity growth over this period, was not just used to increase the size of the economy, which of course you know was happening. Productivity growth associated with growing output. So GDP was growing in all of these countries over this time. But some of that productivity growth, and in fact a quite substantial portion of that productivity growth, it varies depending on the country, went to reducing hours of work. This is really important because it's a part of the story that mainstream economics has at this point totally wiped out of the narrative. The narrative says, how do you maintain high employment in a capitalist economy? Answer, grow. Grow, 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 grow. That's the only answer. And when we had the downturn in 2008, the answer to how to get out of that downturn was expand the economy. But if we look historically, shorter hours of work were absolutely essential to what happened to these countries over this period of time. And high employment could have never been attained without continually pulling labor out of the labor market. Because if you have an economic system that generates so much productivity, which means it has so much labor displacing potential, it's just not possible to keep up with all of that through aggregate growth and aggregate output alone. And of course, it's much more difficult now in wealthy countries which grow much more slowly and in which we have a, let's face it, ecological constraint on growth. So even if we could generate the levels of aggregate growth that would be necessary to reemploy all of our people, and in my country, we're talking about 5, 6, 7% growth in GDP over a couple of years to reemploy the unemployed population. There's no way that's going to happen, and even if it could, it's a disaster on the climate side. So working hours have been really central. Since 1973, some countries have continued the downward trajectory in hours. We know that a number of the continental countries like the Netherlands, Germany, etc. have. The US, and this is a big part of why our unemployment problem is so large relative to, say, Germany's, which weathered this downturn without unemployment, is that we pretty much stalled out on hours reductions, and I'll show you in a minute. In fact, hours began to rise. The UK, which is the blue line here, you have continued to have some hours reductions, but you are far behind many comparable countries, many other wealthy countries on the continent in terms of hours reductions, such as Netherlands, France, Germany, etc. And even more important than that is that there is a rising discourse in Europe that says Europeans should work harder. They should work more hours, they should stay in the labor market longer, etc. It's exactly the wrong direction to go from the point of view of solving unemployment. So this is what happened in the US. The data I just showed you is from employers. If you get data from household surveys where people can also include their second and third jobs, which there's been a rising number of Americans with multiple jobs, you see there's been a big increase in actual working hours on the app, over 200 additional hours per person per year over this period. And you probably in the UK have a similar phenomenon, which is that the employer data show more reductions in hours that have actually happened. You've had the same conversation here about overworked British and overworked UK, downshifting, etc., time pressure that we've had in the United States. So, work time reduction is central to solving the problem of unemployment. I'm going to come back to that in a minute, but I want to get to the second big impact of work time reduction, and that is on ecological footprint, carbon footprint, eco-impact more generally. This is just a simple 2x2 of a few OECD countries' ecological footprint per capita here on the vertical axis, hours worked per employee on the horizontal axis. And what you see is the higher the hours worked, the higher the eco footprint. Now, with a couple of apologies if it's a little bit too wonky, I'm going to show you some models which control for a lot of things and are basically fancy ways of making the point that I just made a minute ago. So this is some work that I'm doing with some sociologists at the Washington State University. And this is a pooled model of all the OECD countries for all of the years from 1961, which is the first year we have the ecological footprint, through to whatever our last year is. I can't remember what it is now. It's probably 2008 or something like that, 2009. Controlling for lots of other things which should affect, or which we know affect ecological footprint from other studies. So controlling for population, controlling for income per capita, fraction of the population in employment, productivity, how urban the population is, and the age structure of the population. I'm going to show you two different sets of measures about footprint. One is what we call the material footprint, which is that's the eco footprint without the carbon, and the other is the carbon footprint. So separating out the two. People are familiar with the ecological footprint measure. I think that's, yeah. So this is the first one, which is the total. Can people see the just small total material ecological footprint? And here we have the results with working hours and GDP in the equations. That's really important. So even controlling for income, what is the impact of changes in working hours on a country's material footprint? And what we find is that the higher the working hours, the higher the footprint. And if we take GDP out, of course, that coefficient gets much bigger because it's picking up both the income dimension of this and the hours dimension of it. Now there are two things that are going on with hours and how they affect eco-footprint and carbon footprint. One is what we might call the scale effect. When hours of work are higher, GDP is higher because we're taking that productivity growth and instead of using it to reduce hours of work, we're using it to produce more. So you work longer hours, you produce more. I mean, of course, we can think of counterexamples, people who work and don't get anything done in those additional hours, but in general, higher hours of work tend to lead to higher output. The second is what we call the compositional effect. As people's time budgets change, their consumption practices change. So they buy different things. When they're more time stressed, they use more carbon. They need to get places faster. The faster you want to do things, the more carbon you use, the more eco-impact you use. Turns out that more time-stressed families tend to have bigger houses, they have more travel, they buy food in more eco-intensive ways and so forth. So there's that compositional effect because the time budget affects people's consumption practices and expenditures as well as the financial budget. So that's the material ecological footprint. Working hours have a big and important effect. That's a big coefficient on eco-footprint. And this is the carbon footprint. You see an even higher coefficient of working hours on the carbon footprint. Again, same results. When you take GDP out of the equation, the work hours gets both those, both the scale effect as well as the compositional effect. Is that? I'm happy to take questions about these. I'm gonna put one more on here, where we see a different result, and this is just CO2 emissions per country. And one of the reasons that we're not exactly sure why the result is different here, and what's the difference in the result? Working hours is not significant in the equation when GDP is in there, so that compositional effect doesn't look like it's working. Of course, work hours is, if you take GDP out, there's still the scale effect, so that it still means that working fewer hours will reduce carbon emissions, but it's through its impact on the size of the economy and not on how people change their behavior. This may also be, this difference we think is being caused by the fact that this is not a consumption measure. And I know this is one of the things that you've had a lot of debate about in the UK, which is that the CO2 emissions coming from this country do not include the CO2 produced for the imports, whereas the eco-footprint measure is a consumption measure, which does include that. And we're trying to work on, figure out whether that's the reason that you get a different result here. Okay, so work hours turn out to be really important in a carbon reduction strategy and an eco-impact strategy. And I just want to go over why that is, not from those regression coefficients, but from a different story. Productivity growth. When you have productivity growth, which is continually being generated in a market economy, and which, by the way, in some countries right now is very rapid because you've had so much labor shedding, so many layoffs that people who are remaining in work are working longer and harder. Companies are rationalizing. They have more pressure on them to reduce costs and raise production in a period like this. So you have a lot of productivity growth that's happening. You can do two things with that productivity growth. You can reduce hours of work, or you can increase the amount that you produce. Is that clear to everyone why that's the case? Okay. So the story of the United States over the last 50 or so, not quite 50 years, increasingly, I think to some extent the story here, fixed is too strong here, but let's say slow reductions in working hours. And the fear about the future for Europe is that you turn away from the trajectory of shorter hours is if you have fixed hours of work, all of that productivity growth goes into rising output and consumption. So, if you want to do something about eco-impact, it has to come here through technology change. And this is a debate you've probably had a lot of. Technology is giving you a certain amount of decarbonization every year, but it keeps getting wiped out because your output is going up, consumption is going up. I call this an end-of-pipe solution. The engineers don't like it. They want to have another couple other arrows here or so forth. But the point is that you have this big effect moving through the system that's working against everything that we're trying so desperately to do here. So we have to run harder and harder and harder just to stay in place because of this. So it's not a great strategy for reducing eco-impact. Now, pull some of that productivity growth out of the system in the form of shorter hours of work. You get less growth in output than you would in the previous scenario. Technology change comes in to do its thing, and it isn't undermined by rebound effects. And this is where the rebound effects are coming from, by the way. Not all of them, but a big part of them come from that scale. And you get a lot more impact on the ecological side. That's why, you know, in a sense, this is a really important part of the story of why working hours, aside from all the stuff I said earlier about unemployment, economic crisis, and all of that, why working hours are so central to reducing eco-impact. I just don't see a scenario for getting to the kinds of reductions in ecological impact that we have to have without reductions in working hours, because I don't think you can slow an economy down without reducing hours of work. You cause a lot of unemployment, and you don't have a feasible politics to get you there. So working hours give you a triple dividend. I've talked about two. One is shorter hours lead to lower unemployment and more job creation. Shorter hours reduce eco and carbon footprints. And benefit three, and this is one that Tim and the folks in Resolve and many at NEF and many other researchers and activists and advocates and so forth in academics in the UK have worked a lot on, is the relationship between time use and stress, happiness, family life, community, etc. And I think that's we've had a lot of talk about that over the last 10 years. That's a pretty well trod path. Let me say something about the policy paths of shorter hours, and I'm happy to talk more about this in the question. These are just a few of the things that you can do. The sort of fiat legislation of, okay, now we're going to have a shorter work week, I think is unlikely to happen in this country. It's certainly unlikely to happen in mine. You could maybe get some progress on that. But there are other things that you can do short of that, because I think that's a harder policy road. One, the Netherlands did this in the beginning of the 1980s, when they were faced with a huge crisis in unemployment, which is, it started with the government. New hires at 80%. That is 4-day work week. It's a great policy because these are people going from no work to some work, so that the difference between 80 and 100 is much more palatable to them than taking people at 100 and reducing them down to 80. There's a big asymmetry in how people experience the trade-off of time and money. And you're much better off not taking money away from people in order to give them free time, but the money that they already have. People are very locked in to income that they already have in a way that they are not to income they haven't yet gotten. So new hiring at shorter hours. It allows you to hire more people and deals with the income dimensions of this in a much better way. Eventually the whole Dutch financial sector went to a 4-day work week. Kind of amazing to think about, given the behavior of finance in the last couple of decades. But that in fact happened. They've had tremendous success with these kinds of policies. V-time, voluntary trade-offs of work. for money. In the United States, before the recession, 60% of people said they were working more hours than they wanted to, and they would appreciate the ability to trade off time for money. Part of why they didn't do it is that they didn't have the ability to within their jobs, or if they do, they have a big career penalty. Netherlands passed a law that said any person in a job has the right to ask for shorter hours in that job, to be accommodated on a reduced work time schedule. It's a legal right now, and by the way, that also means the company cannot give you a plateau in terms of your career trajectory, so they have to keep you on a steady career trajectory. Unemployment payments for short time work, this is something I think people are all very familiar with. A lot of talk about how the Germans used this in the downturn of 2008. Tax credits for employers who provide short-hour jobs, or contracts tying hours reductions to productivity growth. After the Second World War, there was either de facto or de jure a lot of labor contracts that were written that tied wages to productivity growth. Productivity growth went up 3%, real wages went up 3%. That was part of why hours started getting fixed in countries like my own. This is the way to do it for the future. Part of the problem right now is that workers are having trouble capturing any of the benefits of productivity growth. Trying to tie them to tie productivity growth to hours reductions. Again, this is something you can marry with tax credits. Would put momentum into the system for pulling that productivity growth out. Now, let me just say one or two things about the critics. And Tim, we started late. I didn't notice what time. How do I have? What's 5 minutes? Yeah. I know in the UK there's been a lot of debate about the so-called lump of labor fallacy, and I'd like to say that the lump of labor fallacy is its own fallacy. What the lump of labor fallacy says is, the people who think that you have to use work time reduction to get back to full employment are wrong, because we can always create as many jobs as we want. That's essentially what it is. There's a big, you can read tomes and tomes about it, but in the end, that's what it comes down to. I'm just going to talk about 3 things that are wrong with that fallacy. Number 1, we had this debate. Keynes won it, the neoclassicals lost it, and we're living it. Our economies do not always go back to full employment without policy intervention. That's what Keynes taught us. And the lump of labor fallacy gets talked about as if it were something different than this same old debate about the self-correcting nature of the market. But it's not. It's the same debate, because the demand for labor and the demand for goods are just mirrors of each other. So that's the first point. Second point is, we're in a global economy now. Within any region, within any country, it may be possible to generate enough jobs to get full employment, because that's not where capital is. Capital is moving freely. So the lump of labor fallacy is about a closed economy, but we no longer live in a closed economy. The so-called lump of labor fallacy. And the third thing is, we have an ecological constraint on growth. So even if it were true that we could generate as many jobs as we need to without using work time reduction, we can't do it for ecological reasons. So it's a bad discussion, and it's not one that I think really is very, this discussion I think is really not to the point about why we need work time reduction. Didn't the French already fail at this? Great, that's a tremendous propaganda job about a policy, actually, that has been reasonably successful. And one of my PhD students wrote a great article on this. His name is Anders Hayden. It's in a journal called Politics and Society, excuse me. But the point is, business didn't like it, but it actually achieved a number of the objectives that it set out to achieve. It cannot be considered a failure. What can be considered a failure is after the first round, which went pretty well, business had a backlash to it. They took away many of the best dimensions of it, so rounds 2 and 3 were a lot less successful than round one. But no, the French didn't already fail at this. And is shorter work time affordable in hard times? I'm going to skip over because I've gone on too long the answer to that question in detail, but I want to make 2 points about it. So the first one is there's tremendous, so if what's happening is that people are getting shorter hours of work and we're taking productivity growth in that way, if we do that all the way, that means take all of the productivity growth in shorter hours of work, people aren't getting any increases in their real incomes. Now, you can do that for a while. The Dutch did it for 15 years pretty successfully. One of the things that makes it possible is to innovate on the consumption side. So to allow people to meet their needs in new ways. And there's incredible flowering of consumption innovations that allow people to get consumer needs met with low cash outlays. So that's a really important thing. This is free cycle where people are giving away stuff. People are sharing. Fastest growing form of transportation in the world today is bike sharing. They're sharing their couches, they're sharing cars, they're sharing tools. There's tremendous, wonderful innovation going on, web-enabled for the most part, coming out of both the need to get your needs met without lots of cash outlay, but also strong demands from people to build social capital, to rebuild the destroyed social capital of the last decades, and to reduce eco impacts. So, new forms of consumption, time banking, of course, that's something people know a lot about. But the last point I want to make is that, so that's a whole really interesting realm, and I'm studying that now, doing ethnographic studies of a lot of these new consumer innovations that have come up, and they're really interesting. But there's one other thing I want to say about how to cope with a new regime in which people are getting more time and not more money, and that is to ask the question, what do they do with the more time that they're getting? Now, in some of the cases where shorter work time policies or shorter work time implementations haven't worked that well, it's because people didn't know how to use the time. And there's a famous case of the Kellogg workers in the United States who got a 6-hour day, and it was mostly these men, and they went home and they watched TV. And in the end, they preferred more money and going back to the factory. We've got to enable, if people do get more time off the job, and this is also true for the people who are involuntarily underemployed, so people who want jobs and can't get them or have part-time, we've got to do more to help people use their free time in highly productive ways. And one of the really interesting new trends that I've been looking at is what we call self-provisioning, and in particular, what we call high-tech self-provisioning. So that's people using new technologies to make and do things in much more high productivity and efficient ways. And I have here just examples of permaculture and urban food gardening, new forms of home construction using low-cost natural materials, microgeneration of energy, and even so-called Fab Lab technology, small-scale manufacturing that can be done in people's homes or in community centers. So I think one of the keys is to change the way we think about production and move away from that highly specialized model of all production being done in the market, of all manufacturing and food and so forth coming from the market, and to create much more diverse household income streams in which people cope with the moving away from that rising trajectory of income and onto a rising trajectory of time, in which they learn how to meet their needs more cheaply, and also they learn how to meet their needs increasingly by doing things themselves. One of the great things about that, I think, is that, and I'm just going to end here, one of the great things about that last point, the self-provisioning, is that it provides for upskilling and reskilling. It provides for new kinds of creative activity for people. One thing we're seeing in the United States with people who are engaging in this is it also starts them off on new careers and incubates new businesses in these alternative sustainable models that I think can be the core of an emerging new green sector. Thank you.
We do have Juliet here the whole day, so there will be chances to catch her on the way, but I will take a few questions quickly now. Yes, gentleman over here. And do we have two mics, Gemma? Just one? Okay, we go to the gentleman in the glasses there. Thanks. Okay, yeah.
Thank you for a fantastic talk. In order to reduce working hours, is it also necessary to reduce the work spend side and tackle some of the aspects of consumerism, such as advertising?
Okay, let's just take a few questions, Juliet, so we can stack them up. Could you pass the mic to the guy in the blue shirt here?
The Pollution Tax Association. In the 90s, I did was part of some work for the European Commission, which investigated making VAT employment friendly, effectively by giving tax breaks that were aimed at the low pay. And we could show that we could cut government expenditure and create employment. If we've been allowed to go on to do carbon taxes and tax breaks, or subsidies as we call them, I think we could get rid of most unemployment if the carbon tax were high enough. And I believe this would be a mechanism that would be more powerful than changing working hours as a policy, although it would very well work in tandem with that.
And one more question before Juliet.
Okay. Michael Phillips-Smith from Quest for Future Solutions. DEFRA has just released a report valuing the economy.
I can't find the person. Hold on.
I'm here. You're right. DEFRA has just released a report about valuing environmental assets. So we now know for a fact that bee pollination is worth £300 million per annum for the United Kingdom. Is that a valid way forward for us to get the balance right between economic stability and environmental protection?
Wow, okay, three very different questions. Work and spend cycle. If you go back and read my chapter on the work and spend cycle in the Overworked American, one of the things that you see there is that it's driven by the labor market dynamics. And I do believe that that is the most important thing. So that if people are given, if hours are fixed and people are getting rising incomes, they will spend that income regardless of what's happening on the advertising side. I think they're just, and the overspent American, which was, the purpose of the overspent American was to look at the sociological dynamics which made that happen. So my argument there is that inequality and what I call competitive consumption, but pressures to consume coming from the social side are really powerful enough to drive the work and spend cycle. Advertising comes on top of it. So that's my short answer to that question. Not to say that it's not important, but I think it's a much less, my own view is that it's a much less potent driver than what's going on with these economic variables. Certainly carbon taxes are absolutely essential. And I don't want to imply that we could use a strategy of work time reduction without carbon taxes to get where we need to go. So I absolutely agree with you. Number one policy priority, if we could get them, would be a carbon, a high enough carbon tax. However, it's also the case that, particularly in rich countries, I think, if you continue to have the pressure from the aggregate demand side, we can absorb increases in the price of carbon, say, and continue to increase emissions. So that's where you have the rebound problems and so forth. What's that?
But
yeah, well, of course, anything.
There's got to be some elasticity between labour and carbon. You know, if you press the carbon hard enough and subsidise the labour enough, you get the right result.
Right, but the problem of subsidizing labor is you get more people doing more things, producing more output, and all of that output has an impact. It has an impact on energy use, has an impact on all of those other ecosystems.
Culture in your local communities.
Yes, so you need a variety of things. You need the taxes, you need the technology change, and you need the change in the dynamics around the labor market. So these are not substitutes. These are complementary policies, absolutely. Ecosystem valuation. You know, I don't like it because it's taking us in the wrong direction, which is the idea that economic valuation should be driving our relationship to the planet, and that is wrong. One of my colleagues, I was gave a talk on Monday, and one of my colleagues asked the question, not that I liked it, but the war on terror. When we decided to put in all these new anti-terrorism policies, we did not ask how much lost output is there going to be for checking shoes in an airport. We never asked the question about the cost of those policies because we thought this is something really important. A bad outcome here is really important. The same thing is true. I mean, it's so much more true about climate. Climate policy is an insurance for the planet. And he made another great example. The chance of having a fire in your house is minuscule at this point. We've done so much. We've got all these systems in place. If I tell you that your likelihood of having a fire in your house is 1 in 250 years, which is the US, I don't know what it is here, it's probably less here. Are you all going to go out and give up your fire insurance? No. And that's what environmental protection is. It's on climate particularly. So I see why people are going there. In the short term, it's a benefit, but I think the big picture about the environment is that we need to de-link it from economic cost calculations. And it's the right wing, starting in the 1980s, which says every new environmental regulation has to have an economic impact statement and so on and so forth. And I think the more we rush in that direction, the harder it is going to be to get what we need to do.
Great, thanks, Juliet. We're going to take 2 questions, one here and Ethan there, and then we must close that bit of the day. So,
thank you very much for talking us through the policy side. One of the questions left is about political strategy. What does your knowledge of the current period over the last century, where we have seen drops in working hours, tell us about political strategy? In particular, is there an alliance to be formed with trade unions who obviously have taken that agenda forward, but who haven't really ever, I think, recently been thinking about the kind of time agenda so much as pay conditions agenda?
Again, we'll take 2 questions, Julie. Yeah.
No, it's not. I was going to ask if capitalism is the name of the game, and what you were talking about seems eminently sensible way to try and manage it. To what extent is the message being heard about reducing working hours, and to what extent is it being acted on, and if not, why not?
So the first question is about political strategy, and I think that the coalition that can be constructed has 3 legs. One is environmentalists, the other is trade unionists, and the third is people who work on families and communities, because an important dimension of the decline of family and community and the stresses there has to do with time. I mean, inequality is the other big part of it, but those 2 things together, our non-market sector is starved for time because the market has been sucking up so much of our labor time, basically. So I see that as a potentially very powerful alliance. We're not there yet by any means, but I think that that's a direction to go. It has been difficult, and I would say there are kind of two kinds of reactions, and I'm curious, to see what you all think. Environmentalists are increasingly, I think, open to an understanding of the importance of work time reduction in a strategy for sustainability. Where I think it has gotten more difficult is that kind of austerity mentality in the wealthy countries, which is crazy because we're wealthier than ever and yet we feel poorer than ever. So that when I published The Overworked American in 1992, almost everyone said, yes, yes, yes. There was very, very little opposition. Now, even progressives are, there's a segment of progressive for whom work time reduction seems infeasible, utopian, etc. And that's, 30 years of neoliberal ideology, which has both moved it off the table so that even sort of liberal economists who 30 years ago would have been thinking a lot more in these terms have forgotten about work time. And there's just more, I think, kind of visceral reaction like, no, what we need to do is work harder. So it's become counterintuitive in a way that it wasn't. So I do think there's a big educational dimension. But on the other hand, in periods of high unemployment, work time reduction always comes back as a possible solution, always. So it will, as high unemployment continues, you will begin to hear more about it, I think. And that opens up possibilities.
Julie, thank you very much for stimulating the talk.